Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines as we discuss the Palestinian Authority's education system, which continues to indoctrinate their children with hatred for Israel and the Jewish people and glorifies terrorism. On Saturday, 24th of November, the Daily Telegraph published a disturbing article titled "The Palestinian Authority Defies Labour's Calls to Remove Anti-Semitism from Textbooks." It's reported that anti-Semitic propaganda continues to be taught in Palestinian schools, despite the UK government's call for education reforms as part of the recognition of statehood. It's shameful that the Labour government, which has recognised a Palestinian state and is using taxpayer money to help fund the Palestinian education, is inadvertently supporting the incitement of hatred against Israel in the next generation of children while glorifying Palestinian terrorism. And tonight I'm joined by my friends and co-hosts, Pastor Reagan King, and of course my good friend Simon Barrett.
Good to see you, Tim.
Here, yeah.
Simon, so this is it's an excellent report by Impact, but a shocking expose of what we as the UK, as UK taxpayers are funding in the Palestinian Authority.
And Tim, what's so interesting about this report is this is the first publication of monitoring the kind of Palestinian national curriculum for 3 years. And the EU and also Britain had an agreement with the Palestinian Authority that they would continue to fund their education system as long as they took out the kind of jihadi content, the glorification of violence, the horrific rampant Jew hatred that we're seeing in these school textbooks. But sadly, we've seen that the Palestinian Authority has turned a complete blind eye, take no notice of the EU or Britain, and instead is inciting the next generation of Palestinian school children to be the next suicide bombers.
Exactly, and Reagan, of course, you see the impact of when you indoctrinate children, the impact of such a historically and also recently since October the 7th.
Well, 100%, Tim. I can remember 3 months before the 7th of October, Simon, you and I talked about the terror training camps. Nothing's really changed. The ideology hasn't disappeared overnight. Children continue to be indoctrinated, and what's more, they now have hundreds of, maybe even thousands, you could say, more stories that will be used to indoctrinate, and this is how it is. They indoctrinate by saying, Israel wants to destroy you. They indoctrinate by saying, Jews hate you, Israel hates you. It's complete mythology, but they use that to incite this kind of kill or be killed mentality that drives more hatred, and we go again and again through this vicious cycle of hate. So something has to change. It certainly has to begin, at the very least, with international organizations recognizing this as a problem and refusing to be complicit in inciting acts of terror.
Absolutely, because it does nothing to promote peace, it does nothing to promote reconciliation, does nothing to promote tolerance, all the kind of values that the West is supposed to be supporting, but instead supports jihad, violence, terrorism, and rampant anti-Semitism, which is completely unacceptable considering the horrors of what happened on October the 7th.
And of course, it will just lead to more cycles of violence that we saw on October the 7th. So in this programme, we're going to ask the question, how is the UK government helping to prepare the Palestinians for peace? We'll be looking at the Palestinian education system, how it's indoctrinating their children with anti-Semitism and the glorification of terrorism, and of course the celebration of suicide bombers on September the 24th of November, the Daily Telegraph did publish this concerning article titled "The Palestinian Authority Defies Labour's Calls to Remove Anti-Semitism," and it's reported that the propaganda continues to be taught in the Palestinian schools despite the UK government's call for education reforms as part of the recognition of statehood. Impact SE, an NGO that monitors national curricula across the Middle East, discovered the Palestinian Authority's national curriculum in 2025 to 26, intended for 14-year-olds, which includes texts that glorified suicide bombers, wearing explosive belts and praising Palestinian daggers for slashing Israelis' throats. We need to ask ourselves, have we learned anything from what happened on October the 7th? And we see the fruits of this Palestinian hate education and glorification of terrorism. The Daily Telegraph reported back in June 2025 that the government insisted that no foreign aid went to textbooks in Gaza and said it condemned the use of materials. However, in April of 2025, £101 million was allocated to cooperation on education, and Labour also restored the UK funding to UNRWA. It's shameful.
Absolutely, and to fit in with this particular vision that we're seeing of the Palestinian Authority inciting their children with hatred and violence and preparing them to be the next generation of terrorists, it's also important to look at Scripture and to see what Scripture has to say. So for this one, we're going to Matthew chapter 18, verses 2 to 6. It says the following: Then Jesus called a little child to him and set him in the midst of them, and said, Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means either enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one of these little child like this in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of those little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depths of the sea.
It's a very, very sage point that is made there, very apt for this particular situation. To recognize that these are individuals, these are children, they know nothing else other than what they are taught, what's instilled into them. And from the earliest age, we've seen the videos, we've seen the photographic evidence of it. We have heard firsthand accounts of people who've gotten out of this demonic system where they even will dress up infants as Hamas terrorists. That we've seen the videos of toddlers running around with Hamas bandanas and being paraded as part of this sort of glorious thing. So they had children dancing in front of the coffins of Kafir and Ariel Bibas. This is something that has long been the case. Anyone who thought that it would be different, well, this is exposed that it is no different. You cannot destroy the ideology unless the change happens from within.
Amen to that. And also, this is state-sanctioned child abuse.
That's right.
On a huge, massive level.
The West is complicit.
Of course it is, by funding their education system. It's quite easy to stop it. You stop funding them, as simple as that. But share your thoughts and reflections, Tim, particularly on this new report by Impact SE, where they've monitored the national curriculum for this academic year, 2025-2026, where the Palestinian Authority promised the West that they would reform its education. But again, jihad, again, terrorism, again, rampant Jew hatred, glorification of Palestinian terrorism, even within their kind of like science classes or physics classes, even within their maths, they include this kind of indoctrination. So how are we going to see a peace dividend when the Palestinian Authority are preparing the next Palestinian terrorists to carry out the next October the 7th? Because it starts in the classrooms.
That's right. And my thoughts, like yourself, my initial thoughts was, I mean, this is clear child abuse, but at the same time, my thoughts go back to Nazi Germany, when you had Hitler Youth and you had the children there indoctrinated from a young age. And it required post-World War II a whole process called denazification, and we knew this was needed after October the 7th in Gaza, for example. We knew it needed a denazification process, a de-Hamasification process, and seeing as well that we recognise a statehood, which was painful for so many of us as believers who are praying and interceding and know our history in terms of the Jewish people and our treatment and our relationship with Israel, going back to the breaking of our promise during the Balfour Declaration and post-World War II. It was painful that we recognise a statehood, but to see now that we're helping fund an education system that continues to spread the hate and indoctrination that we saw on October the 7th, well, it's clear this is just going to lead to a more cycle of violence, Reagan. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think it's been on my mind since all of this kicked off that unless something fundamental changes, we're going to have the risk of another October the 7th within 20 years. You can look at some of these horrendous atrocities that have been committed massive profile atrocities against Israeli citizens, civilians, and it is almost like a generational thing. You have it a major flare-up every 20 years with smaller flare-ups here and there scattered. The ideology remains, and so until there's a recognition, there can't actually be any reform. UNRWA is being funded, continues to deny complicity in acts of terror, continues to deny even how it's worded. It's so politically and euphemistically worded. No funding has gone directly to these textbooks. Directly is the key word.
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay, so you didn't actually fund the authoring of this, you didn't fund the printing of it as such, but indirectly, funding is going to different outlets that enables these things to be authored, published, illustrated, and disseminated across the entirety of.
It's coming from our taxes.
Yeah.
That is what's so shameful about this, that you know, the Palestinian Authority is preparing for another kind of massacre by indoctrinating their children with state-sanctioned child abuse to poison their minds with hatred, rampant Jew hatred, glorification of violence and terrorism and jihad. And yet we, the British taxpayer, are actually paying for this. Yeah. And it's also very shameful, again, on this Labour government, because they've recognised the Palestinian state. And I think this is morally reprehensible. And I think it's spiritually and politically wrong. But having said that, if you're going to recognise a Palestinian state, then put the mechanisms in place by saying that no way is the Palestinian Authority ready for peace. And one big aspect of reform needs to be done is with our education system, right? And so the government knows about this. They can try and turn a blind eye to it. But the thing is, you can't hide the truth. And of course, what this is doing is preparing for a future generation to carry out more terrorist attacks against Israel.
Well, let's look at some of what's actually in these textbooks, shall we? The report by the International Research Group, Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education, Impact SC, found numerous examples of what it said was violent anti-Israel and anti-Semitic material in the textbooks. Now, some people would say, well, they would chime in, they wouldn't read it, and they would say, well, hold on, but being anti the Israeli government or being anti the IDF, that's not necessarily anti-Semitic. Okay, let's look at actually what they find. The grade 7 teacher guide described Israelis bashing children's heads in front of their mothers, complete fabrication, and mutilating women for jewelry, very bizarre, while instructing students to visually recreate the event with drawings. Absolutely horrendous. A grade 8 Arabic language textbook for 14-year-old Palestinian children is alleged to feature a text that glorifies suicide bombers wearing explosive belts and praises Palestinians' daggers slashing Israelis' throat. No mention of government or IDF as if that would be any better, but complete fabrication of events that have never occurred. At the same time, a grade 12 textbook gets even more extreme, is alleged to include a poem that urges students to return to Israeli cities with a weapon in your hand, with one science textbook including an illustration showing a slingshot regularly used in the Palestinian Intifada against Israel to illustrate Newtonian physics.
Absolutely, and that is a quote from the Daily Telegraph, published on Saturday, the 22nd November, under the following headline: Palestinian Authority defies Labour's calls to remove anti-Semitism from textbooks. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN report dating back to 2021, the last time that Impact SE monitored the Palestinian national curriculum.
During 2020, Palestinian children, like many others around the world, couldn't go to school due to COVID-19. During that time, United Nations Relief Works Agency, or UNRWA, produced and provided the students material that went way beyond reading, writing, and arithmetic.
We found that it contains various violations of UN values, of UNESCO standards, and of UNRWA's own principles. These were educational materials which were distributed to over 320,000 Palestinian children across the West Bank and Gaza.
Marcus Sheff leads a group that monitors peace and cultural tolerance in schools. It examined the material sent to those children, and what they found was not good.
The idea that UNRWA, a UN organization, is distributing material which calls on students to defend the motherland with blood, or that glorifies terrorists and directs students to terrorists like Dalal Mughrabi, who is in their materials a role model for young girls, somebody who murdered 38 people, including 13 children on a civilian bus.
This impact group report from January lays out examples found throughout the curriculum. In mathematics, students are asked to write the number of martyrs in the First Intifada. A language studies question asks students to find the preposition in a sentence like, Jihad is one of the doors to paradise. And in social studies, where Zionist policy is blamed for exhausting Palestinian natural resources.
It was written by UNRWA's teachers. Now, UNRWA's teachers are supposed to be trained in UN values of peace and tolerance.
Following the January impact report, UNRWA admitted to the problem and assured governments it had been addressed. A follow-up study by the impact team, however, shows that was not the case.
Within these materials, we also found hateful material which young people anywhere should not be studying, and certainly not being taught by a UN organization. So, I think what we see here is that, UNRWA is absolutely part of the problem in relation to the incitement of young people in the region.
In one social studies exercise, sixth graders are shown a map of the British mandate called Palestine that does not include any Israel reference, and told Palestine is the geographical area which extends from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the River Jordan in the east, and from Lebanon and Syria in the north to the Gulf of Aqaba and Egypt in the south. Its location gave it strategic importance, making it coveted by invaders and colonial powers. And there's another problem.
And that is, if you've distributed print materials to 320,000 children, then you found that you had been distributing hateful material. How exactly did UNRWA get those materials back? We have no answer to that.
Former President Trump cut funding to UNRWA because of this kind of incitement in Palestinian schools. President Biden has pledged to resume humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. Sheff maintains the world should expect transparency from any United Nations body. And until UNRWA can prove otherwise, it should be understood the organization teaches hate. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And thanks to our friends at CBN for that report on Palestinian education, which was actually from 2021, which was before October the 7th. Now, in the Telegraph report, it describes how Impact SC pointed out that foreign aid for education in the Palestinian Authority is used not only to fund teachers and schools, but also education sector civil servants responsible for drafting, approving and delivering a harmful curriculum. The UK previously ended direct funding for PA education in October 2021 due to the presence of materials not acceptable to the House or the government. The London and Tel Aviv-based Impact SC says its analysis of the new academic year's textbook suggests that the PA has ignored calls from the UK government to reform the curriculum, and that it's been one of the primary reforms requested by the UK and other international partners as part of the recent recognition of a Palestinian state. In April 2025, the UK signed a memorandum of understanding with the PA, which featured no explicit conditionality on curriculum reforms. Let's remind ourselves what Sir Keir Starmer said when he recognised Palestinian statehood earlier this year.
In the face of the growing horror in the Middle East, we are acting to keep alive the possibility of peace and a two-state solution. That means a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable Palestinian state. At the moment, we have neither. Ordinary people, Israeli and Palestinian, deserve to live in peace, to try to rebuild their lives free from violence and suffering. That's what the British people desperately want to see. Yet, almost 2 years after the barbaric attacks of October the 7th, hostages are still held by the terrorists of Hamas. Recent images show the hostages suffering and emaciated. Hamas even refuse to release all the bodies of the dead. I have met British families of the hostages. I see the torture that they endure each and every day, pain that strikes deep in people's hearts across Israel and here in the United Kingdom. The hostages must be released immediately, and we will keep fighting to bring them home. Let's be frank. Hamas is a brutal terror organization. Our call for a genuine two-state solution is the exact opposite of their hateful vision. So we are clear, this solution is not a reward for Hamas, because it means Hamas can have no future, no role in government, no role in security. We have already prescribed and sanctioned Hamas, and we will go further. I have directed work to sanction other Hamas figures in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, the man-made humanitarian crisis in Gaza reaches new depths. The Israeli government's relentless and increasing bombardment of Gaza, the offensive of recent weeks, the starvation and devastation are utterly intolerable. Tens of thousands have been killed, including thousands as they tried to collect food and water. This death and destruction horrifies all of us. It must end. We have evacuated the first group of sick and injured children to the United Kingdom to be treated by the NHS, and we continue to increase our humanitarian support. But still, nowhere near enough aid is getting through. We call again on the Israeli government to lift the unacceptable restrictions at the border, stop these cruel tactics, and let the aid surge in. With the actions of Hamas, the Israeli government escalating the conflict, and settlement building being accelerated in the West Bank, the hope of a two-state solution is fading. But we cannot let that light go out. That is why we are building consensus with leaders in the region and beyond around our framework for peace. This is a practical plan to bring people together behind a common vision and a series of steps, including the reform of the Palestinian Authority, that takes us from a ceasefire in Gaza to negotiations on a two-state solution. We will keep driving this forward. As part of this effort, I set out in July the terms upon which we would act in line with our manifesto to recognise Palestinian statehood. That moment has now arrived.
Shame on you, Keir Starmer, for recognising a Palestinian state, but also calling for urgent reforms of the Palestinian Authority. Clearly that's not going anywhere, so you need to hold Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, to account over its education system and the fact that we are paying for this hatred and indoctrination of violence, terrorism and glorification of jihadi violence against Israel. And let's go and see what the British government's response is after finding out through this SE report on the Palestinian national curriculum hasn't changed one iota. So we have the Yvette Cooper, who's our Foreign Secretary, told the Commons on Tuesday that reform of the curriculum was needed. This is what she said: that at this crucial part of the Palestinian Authority reforms, I've discussed that directly with President Abbas. The importance of maintaining the commitments that the Palestinian Authority has made to curriculum reforms must be central in both the West Bank and Gaza. We also see that Hirsch Falconer, who's a Middle East minister, recently confirmed that the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas is committed to the development of a school curriculum that is free from incitement, and the UK government has called for the PA to ensure that an independent audit is conducted to verify these reforms have been completed. The Impact SC report's finding will increase pressure on the government. So again, we're hearing talk from our Foreign Secretary, from a minister in the Foreign Office who's associated with the Middle East, saying the British government has urgently put the request to Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, to carry out reforms of their education system. But does it actually look like he's listening?
Well, you know, whenever I hear this, I just think, are we so naive? How many years, how many decades have we just believed everything? Oh, he's given us assurances. Mahmoud Abbas has given us the assurances that it'll be okay, it's sorted. Are we meant to take their word for it when repeatedly that word has been broken? There's no concept of any cultural, normality of deception, any ideological drive to deceive for the purpose of reconciliation. There's nothing involved in that, and there's no evidence, certainly from this report that we've seen, the evidence is to the contrary of any efforts to actually mitigate against extremism in their textbooks.
So we got another two responses, this time from Damien Egan, he's an MP from the Labour Friends of Israel, he's their vice chair, said the following: this report shows that despite the PA's warm words saying they support peaceful coexistence, a two-state solution and a commitment to reform, the sad reality is that in schools nothing has changed. It's obviously wrong. The international community can't continue to turn a blind eye. And then we got Greg Smith, who is a member of Parliament. He is the vice chair of Conservative Friends of Israel, says the following: at a time when everyone in the region should be uniting around a clear agenda for peace, Palestinian children are being fed a diet of hate and extremism, all with the help of funding from the UK taxpayer. It is shameful, but at least we're having some of the Conservative Party speak out about this, including members of the Labour Party themselves speaking out against this, and really we need the British taxpayer and the electorate to speak out as well.
Absolutely, and it's an issue that affects all of us in the West. We've seen what Jew hatred, what it leads to from October the 7th, what happens there in the Middle East. It's bred from this education, this hate has an effect for the Jewish community in our country. Let's have a little look about a further look at who Impact SC are before we look at the contents of this worrying report. It really was an excellent report, and Impact SC, as mentioned, they are an organisation based in London and Tel Aviv, and they research school textbooks, teachers' guides and curricula to assess whether young people are being educated to accept others, which means their neighbours, minorities or even the nation's enemies, and to solve conflicts through negotiation and compromise while rejecting hatred and violence. Education, as we know, is one of the most powerful tools used to mitigate extremist influences and moderate ideological prejudice, as well as a core component in securing more tolerant and open-minded societies in the future. However, education, as we know, can be used to promote negative influence, skew historical narrative, hatred of others, gender inequalities, and even political violence. The Impact stands for the Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School and Education, and it's international research and policy organisation that monitors and analyses, as we said, education around the world, employing standards of peace, tolerance and non-violence according to UNESCO declarations and resolutions to determine compliance and advocate for change when necessary. Reagan, why don't we also have a look at go a bit further into what actually is contained in this report and how scary and frightening it is?
Well, so their comprehensive review of the Palestinian Authority's 2025 to 2026 national school curriculum analyzes 290 textbooks. This is incredibly comprehensive, right? 71 teacher guides as well, used in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem schools. So this is even within Israeli territory as such in East Jerusalem, including UNRWA sponsored schools. This study finds the material substantively unchanged from prior editions and documents recurring patterns across subjects, so nothing's changed. Promotion of jihad and martyrdom are present, glorification of terrorism, incitement of anti-Semitism, rejection of peacemaking and the two-state solution, as well as the erasure of Israel from the maps. And this is those of us who've traveled in the land and those of us who've been in those territories underneath Palestinian Authority control have seen firsthand there's no desire for a two-state solution. Keir Starmer is like, we recognize a Palestinian state. The Palestinian Authority hears, oh, we recognize you denying Israel its right. If you recognize a Palestinian state, we'll have it all, please. That's what they want. That's what their drive is. The report notes themes across subjects, including science and math textbooks. Make it make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, but how, look, I mean, you have your children in school, and you can guarantee that in their school they will not be opening a maths book or a physics book and then see, for example, the incitement of violence and hatred with references to how many Palestinians died in Israel's last intifada, which was from, 2000 to 2005, that Israel faced, in which Israel destroyed and killed many terrorists. And yet this is in these textbooks. And there's graphic examples there as well in physics and in biology and in maths as well. There's no place for this. In normal school textbooks, you would just not find this. Not in the Western world anyway.
It's the kind of thing you'd expect actually in medieval times, you know, that ancient anti-Semitic stereotype and the lies and the darkness. Some of the examples in the report that the report gives, as reported by the Times of Israel on the 19th of November, under the following headline: despite promised reforms, the PA textbooks still teach anti-Semitic, anti-Israel messages. And it describes in this report examples of twisting every subject to their narrative, their agenda.
Absolutely, Tim. I mean, on page 26, we have it's a science and math study. The first example that you'll see there is in relation to general sciences, and it's Newtonian physics is taught through an example of a young girl shooting a rock with a slingshot toward a specific target, with an accompanying photo showing, and you see it there, a hand hurling a loaded slingshot. In Palestinian culture, slingshots are strongly associated with attacks on Israeli soldiers, a technique popularized during the time of the First Intifada between 87 and 93.
Yeah, and another example of this one, many of you actually be aware of the whole Mohammed al-Dura situation, where we saw a father shielding his young son from a crossfire in which Israel was blamed for the killing of the son, but it turns out that this was done by the Palestinian Authority, and this ignited the Second Intifada. So we see in this textbook that, for example, that Life and Sciences, Science and Agriculture, grade 11, volume 1, where there's a big reference to Mohammed al-Dura, which has nothing to do with science or agriculture.
Absolutely, and further in the report, it says it talks about in their maths lessons, in their 4th grade maths textbook, the basic calculus is taught by counting the number of martyrs, unbelievably, in the 2 Palestinian intifadas or waves of uprisings. The inflated figures offered by the textbooks includes a large number of Palestinian militants and terrorists killed in action during these periods, but includes more than 150 suicide bombers, of course glorifying suicide bombing, which are grouped indiscriminately with civilian deaths, and a photograph of a funeral procession is placed next to the questions, reinforcing the macabre nature of the exercise. Shocking thing to teach children.
No,
You have
absolutely.
the Arabic language one there as well, I think, Simon.
Yes, Reagan, and of course 51 of this report in the Arabic language is the kind of glorification of a Palestinian terror battle against Israeli forces after the Six-Day War in 1967, which talks about all blood and guts, in which many soldiers were killed in that brutal attack. Very, very close to the Dead Sea, and yet we see within these textbooks is the glorification of Palestinian terrorism and violence, this time against the IDF.
Absolutely. And in the same report, it describes how the 1972 Munich massacre of athletes, don't forget, by these terrorists, is glorified in history. It says an 11th grade history textbook endorses the massacre as an expression of legitimate Palestinian resistance. In a subsection in the history of the Palestinian liberation movement, the textbook refers to an incident when the Fatah firm Black September Group took 11 Olympic Israeli team members hostage, killing them with a West German police officer. And of course, that was glorified and that was presented as legitimate. So very, very worrying things in this report, are very worrying examples of how the children are being indoctrinated to become another generation of suicide bombers, of terrorists and of Jew haters.
And that's very disturbing because, of course, the Munich massacre of 1972 was one of the darkest hours in Olympic history. It's nothing to be proud about, it's nothing to honour. The way that these Israelis were then kind of murdered by Black September, and of course then they threw a grenade while they were all in a helicopter. This is one of the greatest tragedies in Olympic history, and yet here we see within the Palestinian Authority textbook glorifying this murder against these Israeli athletes of 1972, and this is in a history lesson.
Yeah, and science lessons as well. In an 8th grade science textbook, students learn about elements of air through a story describing Israeli security forces launching tear gas in the Ramallah area of the West Bank. Next to the passage, there's a photo of a masked individual holding a slingshot. Another example in a 7th grade science textbook says, before it's introducing liquid solutions, the opening page dedicated to Palestinian prisoners. The page claims that salt and water play a key role in the hunger strikes of Palestinian prisoners, alongside an illustration of an anthropomorphic stomach breaking chains, holding a Palestinian flag and a dove of peace, surviving only on salt and water is the quotation translated. In the same book, students studying human physiology through a narrative of Israeli soldiers see a picture of them firing tear gas and smoke grenades at a youth camp near Ramallah. The incident is presented as entirely unprovoked, and students are asked to identify bodily systems activated by fear and stress.
Now, in another extract from this examination of the Palestinian national curriculum, we see that 1st grade Arabic reading exercise introduces the word shahid, or martyr, to teach about a letter. In Palestinian society, the word martyr is typically someone who is killed in a conflict with Israel. And then in 2nd grade Arabic, a poem is recited to students reading, "We give our souls for the revolution. We carry the flames of the revolution to Haifa, to Jaffa, to Alaska, and the Dome of the Rock." And of course, this is the kind of Islamic component on all of this. So we see that really there's not much difference, is there, Tim, between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in its stated jihadi goals to destroy Israel, because clearly here they're calling for a revolution, they're calling for a massacre against the Jewish people and against Israelis, and they have their desires to conquer Haifa, desires to conquer Tel Aviv, and also then to conquer Jerusalem as well.
Of course, and one oft-repeated feature of this education report is the fact that they always draw the map of Palestine, but from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. So literally Israel doesn't exist to them. They are constantly referring to Israel as the Zionist entity or the Zionist occupier. Now, we've said from the start And what we have to realize as believers is this is a spiritual battle. This is not about land. We keep saying that, we keep saying this to the guys that think this is about land or this is about an oppressive occupier. This is spiritual. This is a spirit that wants to see the Jewish people wiped out. It's all about Jerusalem as well, that rock of stumbling. They called October the 7th Alaska Flood. But when you see the textbooks, when you hear that the PA is identical to Hamas in their ideology, that the whole land should be theirs and that Israel should be driven into the sea, ideologically at least, but also by raising that next generation of shaheeds or martyrs, you realize this is a spiritual battle, and you realize this is not about geography, land or history or anything else. This is that Islamist agenda and spirit to wipe out the Jewish people. And of course, it's the Jewish people, not just Israelis, that are singled out as the enemies of the martyrs.
And what we see, you rightly highlighted, from the first grade all the way through, by the time you get to 8th grade, teachers are instructed to teach that Zionism is modern terrorism and it's destined to disappear. The right of return must not be relinquished, this referring to the demand that millions of descendants of Palestinians who fled or were expelled in 1948 be allowed to return and settle inside the state of Israel, leading to, of course, the complete destruction of the state of Israel, which Israel views as a recipe for its destruction. And by the time you get to the 10th grade, history teachers, God instructs educators to reject UN resolutions, even those calling for peace, if they are perceived to undermine Palestinian national rights. So the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, whoever it is playing the UN for fools.
Yeah, but also the other aspect of this one is that, our Western media, our government love to portray Fatah or the Palestinian Authority as the moderate force of the Palestinian people. But the reality is, according to these school textbooks, they're just as bad as Hamas.
Well, Fatah existed before Hamas, and Fatah was the orchestrator of so many groups of Fedayeen, is what they call them. Who, and so there is ideologically no difference. The two hate each other's guts, but the enemy of your enemy is not necessarily your friend.
No. And that's one feature of these peace processes was this call constantly for the PA to take over Gaza. And a lot of people that know about the PA and know about that were saying, well, that makes no sense, because what we're going to see is that same hatred, that same cycle of hatred. And you can see the evidence there in the education.
Absolutely. So the following article in the Times of Israel reported the following, that the key commitment on educational reform was made in July of 2024, when the Palestinian Authority signed a letter of intent with the EU's European Commission pledging to reform its curriculum. The report goes on to say that in 2024, the letter of intent in which the Palestinian Authority committed to changing the curriculum served as the basis for the transfer of over $400 million, or the equivalent of $462 million from euros, from the European Union to the Palestinian Authority between July and September 2024. The conditioned on meeting education-related reforms and benchmarks. This followed previous years in which the EU froze funding over incitement concerns. Now, the big question is, if, for example, the British taxpayers, which we are, European taxpayers, are funding the Palestinian education system, and we're chucking huge amounts of money at the Palestinian Authority, then why isn't there a proper audit in place? Why is there not a proper kind of monitoring of their school books, their education system, what Palestinian children are being taught in Ramallah, in Jenin, or even in Gaza? Because quite frankly, this is preparing the next generation of suicide bombers against Israel. And of course, no one wants the perpetual conflict to continue, because this is brainwashing and this is poisoning young minds. So surely it shouldn't take, for example, Impact SE to get hold of these textbooks, to do a proper study on them, translate them from Arabic into English and various languages, in order for European nations and the EU to wake up to the reality of the Palestinian education system.
There shouldn't be any funding anyway going that direction, because then we get into this deal. We now have to shell out more. We now have to fund that adjudication system. and that adjudication system is going to fail anyway. This is an ideology that is not going to be destroyed just because we have some adjudicators who will themselves have the wool pulled over their eyes. This is what always happens.
No, absolutely. So another example of what we can expect to see in these textbooks is found in this one. So a 10th grade history textbook claims that after World War II, the Zionists helped the US and that it would support the establishment of their national homeland in Palestine by exploiting their political, media and financial influences in the States. And according to the study, in some cases, Israelis are portrayed as demonic figures, accused of atrocities and portrayed as inherently evil. Poems and songs grant legitimacy to violence and teach their children the very existence is illegitimate. So how is this going to help further peace and reconciliation when there's an absolute hatred and demonization the other side? And particularly knowing that children's minds are young and they're fertile and they're impressionable. I mean, this is comparable really to the Nazi youth in the way that these children are being indoctrinated. So how can we expect, for example, when these children become adults, that they will want to live in peace with Israel, that they will want reconciliation, they will want tolerance? No, they will want violence and jihad because this has been indoctrinated them from such a young early age.
That's right, and the reason, for example, Jesus said, unless you have faith like a small child, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven, because they believe what they're told. So faith is like you take God at his word. But in the same way, in an adverse way, if you tell a child that the Jewish people are occupiers who are oppressing you and this is your land and etc., and a shaheed is a heroic fighter of truth and for God, well, they're going to believe that. They're going to grow up with that worldview. And in fact, you know, studies show that children form actually the views they have for adults by quite a young age. And so what we're seeing here, and going back to that point, this is clearly child abuse and this is indoctrination and brainwashing, but the reason it's so powerful and so effective for Hamas and for the PA to use the education is because clearly it creates a worldview that stays with these kids for their life and creates a hate and a situation where they see killing Jews. And what we saw on October the 7th, if you remember, you saw a terrorist killing Jewish women and children, ringing his parents, and they're excited and they're jubilant. How does that happen? How do you get to that level of hatred? Well, it's clear education is a big part of that, Reagan.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's one example, Quranic verses used to teach that the children of Israel, and you can look, it's in the Quran, it's in the Hadith, the traditions they teach that the children of Israel are corrupt, destined for destruction, and divinely punished. So if you wrap this in religious ideology, Tim, you're having this situation where, okay, if you are Muslim and the children of Israel who are around you, they are corrupt, inherently corrupt, destined for destruction and divinely punished, you are a catalyst to carry out the will of Allah.
That's right.
And when you demonize the other, then you do that for over many years throughout the education system. You have someone who believes that they are doing a favor to God and to the world. They legitimately believe this.
Yeah, and haven't we seen this outplay in October the 7th? You know, this was the biggest mass terrorist attack in Israel's history, whereby Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad murdered over 1,200 Israelis and foreign nationals. We had mass rapings, mutilations, and we had the most horrific torture, including putting babies in ovens. And so therefore that comes from this education system. You can't, for example, infect those minds with so much hatred and propaganda without this first starting with children in the education system. I mean, the irony of the Oslo Accords is that prior to the Oslo Accords, the Israelis and the Palestinian Arabs would visit Jenin, they'd visit Israel, but what the PA has done through the Oslo Accords is separate the two nations. So these two nations don't mix, they don't integrate. They can't build a kind of mutual respect for each other. Instead, the Palestinian Authority is literally poisoning these young minds. And of course, we saw the horrors of what happened on October the 7th as a direct consequence of this education. But what makes it worse is that we are helping to fund this education through our hard-earned money that's paying into the taxes, which our government is then giving to the Palestinian Authority, saying, okay, we've got words from Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, and assurances everything will be fine, we'll deal with this in its own time, when the reality is we should cut funding, cut support, so that we then send a very powerful message to the PA that this is unacceptable and should be tolerated.
Absolutely.
And going back to the fact that we're not just throwing hundreds of millions from the West into the PA, it's not being audited properly. As you said, it took this report by Impact SE to uncover this stuff. Some of these nightmarish kind of what you'd expect in the Middle Ages depictions of Jewish people and accusations that, for example, they released pigs to the Palestinians' fields to destroy them. Or I've heard Palestinians say seriously, really believe that Israel is poisoning their wells, etc. The kind of stuff you get from medieval times. Well, if we're throwing millions of pounds, Reagan, we've got to ask the question. I mean, this is our taxpayer money, and we had to ask the question when we see how rich, for example, the Hamas leaders were, billionaires. This is not being audited. This is not being, there's no accountability with this money, and clearly this is a concern for us as taxpayers.
Well, we have an immense deficit as it is. We're continuing to fund organizations that propagate and are perpetuating a cycle of constant bloodletting that are demonizing our fundamental ally. You know, I think, and I would support our tax funding to go to Israel for initiatives that would seek to, in some way, bring about meaningful and lasting change and peace between communities. But
I'll tell you what, I was at an Israeli school a few weeks ago in Herzliya, and it was called President Chaim Weizmann School. They were celebrating their 100th anniversary. Did I see this hatred of the Palestinians and demonization of the Arabs? No. All I heard was them, these school children, singing a song that reflects the 100th anniversary of the founding of this school and the history of Chaim Weizmann, who was a professor at the University of Manchester and was one of the Zionist leaders. But also, they sung the Israeli national anthem. There was no death chants. There was no hatred towards the Arabs or the Palestinians whatsoever. So to compare and contrast the Israeli education system, which is probably better than most Western education, is something that should be noted. Having personally seen and went to visit an Israeli school in Herzliya. Now, Hassan Fleur, who is the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, has come up with her idea of how to reform the Palestinian education system. And this is a report through CBN.
The international community regularly criticizes Israel for the living conditions of Palestinians. Jerusalem Deputy Mayor Fleur Hassan Nahum argues those critics are the problem, however, for funding education that incites hatred by using Palestinian Authority textbooks.
And why is that bad? Unfortunately, we have incitement in that curriculum. We have glorification of martyrdom, complete denial of the existence of Israel.
Arabs make up 37% of Jerusalem's population, and almost all of their children study the PA curriculum. Hassan Nahum says beyond the hatred, there's a practical side to the problem.
For me, as somebody here who's worried about all the children in my city, they don't teach any Hebrew and terrible English, which means that when they're 18 years old, these kids graduate, they cannot be integrated into any economic opportunity, any quality employment, any higher education here. And so what the curriculum does is a curriculum of institutionalizing poverty.
The Palestinian Authority wants its future capital in the eastern part of a divided Jerusalem. Israel opposes that idea. Most Arabs living there have resident status, with many of the same privileges of Israelis.
When we polled them, 50% of Arab families want to be part of the Israel curriculum. The Israeli curriculum is an Arab curriculum. It's not a Zionist curriculum. All we're doing is taking out the incitement and bringing in Hebrew as a second language.
Many of the Arab schools are under the UN body that's taken care of Palestinian refugees for more than 70 years.
We have school books here which honor murderers throughout the books and talk about dying for the right of return. This is wrong. This is not appropriate for a United Nations agency.
Researcher David Bedeen has studied Palestinian textbooks and UN facilities for years.
Every Jewish city is replaced with an Arab name so that children grow up with the idea that there is no Israel, a Zionist entity that has to be ignored and or wiped out.
That's why Bedeen and Hassan Nahum want to see donor nations restrict funding until there's a change.
There's 54% of the funds that they will give UNRWA goes to education. We're saying something very simple. Put that on the side in escrow, make them change their curriculum, take out the incitement, give them opportunity in that curriculum, bring them technological subjects instead of hatred and paramilitary activity.
If the international community gets on board, Hassan Nahum says the impact would be far-reaching.
And there's no reason why the Arab community should not be part of the prosperity of the startup nation of Israel. And this is what we're doing here. And Jerusalem is the arena where this is going to play out, but it's going to be good for the entire country and hopefully peace and coexistence in the entire region.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News.
Thank you to CBN for their report on the former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, Fleur Hassan's ideas for reforms in education. Thank you to Reagan and Simon for today's show and ideas. And just to conclude, it is shameful, actually it's a disgrace, that our taxes are being used to fund this education, Palestinian Authority's education system, which breeds hatred for the Jewish people, breeds hatred for Israel, and raises a new generation of terrorists and martyrs. The British government should now cease all funding for the Palestinian Authority and end as well its recognition of a Palestinian state. And most importantly for us as believers, this is a time to pray. This is darkness. It's darkness that doesn't just affect Israel and the Middle East, it affects us as believers. We're uniquely tied to Israel, and we have so much to be grateful for to the Jewish people who gave us so much in terms of our faith. And so to see them demonized like this is our time to pray, to look up and always keep our eyes on Jesus.